Hey everyone, welcome to today's conversation, which is on the mysteries of mind, trying to gain some insight into those deep and compelling qualities of experience that happen inside of our heads, where it comes from, and can it be replicated, and can it be described mathematically? All these deep questions about consciousness. And we're so pleased to have one of the great world experts on this subject joining us for this conversation. That is Christof Koch, who has devoted his entire career to understanding the brain, the mind, and the nature of consciousness. He is a neurophysiologist and computational neuroscientist who serves as the chief scientist of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation, where he seeks to understand the physical substrate of consciousness in the brain. Prior to that, Christof was the president and chief scientist of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, where he continues to do research. So I'm honored to welcome Christof Koch to the conversation. Christof, how are you doing?
Thank you very much, Brian. I feel very well. I just came off rowing here in beautiful on our Lake Union here. So I feel full of vim and vigor.
We couldn't ask for more for this conversation. So I just wanted to preface our discussion of the mind and consciousness with just a little bit of background on where you came into this subject. Because if I'm not mistaken, you're trained as a physicist, at least at some point in your career. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have my PhD in physics and minor in philosophy. Well, I mean, I come to it like you, like every human, sooner or later comes to it. That voice inside my head, right? That the movie I see all the time, my pains and pleasures, wishes, desires, fears, dreams. How do they come into an otherwise dead universe? If you have, and if you think about it with pain, so let's say your toothache, your tooth hurts, and scientifically we know what happened. Uncontroversially, there's an inflamed part that generates electrical activity that travels around the trigeminous nerve, gets switched over in the spinal cord, goes through an intermediate relay in the thalamus, and then finally, excites neuron in the cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain. Ultimately, that means some ions are sloshing around, sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions. Why should they hurt? Why should anything hurt? In my liver, there are also ions sloshing around in my liver. My liver never seems to have experience, or my kidney, or any of the other organ. The brain seems to be the organ of consciousness. So I mean, and that's the heart of the mind-body problem. How do you go from the physics of the world and the physics of organs like the brain to experiences?
Yeah. Now, I share that deep sense of wonder at how it could be that the motion of physical particles or ions somehow yield inner sensations. But sometimes I wonder, and just want to get your take on it. Do we make too much of the mystery of consciousness in the following sense? It's only mysterious when we try to understand it from the outside perspective. But the outside perspective is the very perspective that has no direct access to consciousness. And so it's going to be mysterious because of that lack of direct access. So should we have expected this mystery, so to speak?
Well, even if that's the case, we might develop tools to directly give us access to your or other people's or other organisms' conscious experience, right? Who knows, in the fullness of time, given our rapidly evolving understanding. But even before that, we are still humans who yearn to understand. And, as you well know, there's a school in quantum mechanics that it's called shut up and calculate, right? Don't worry about all these problems. Practically speaking, science works great. All of that's true, but we cannot help but worry, where does that sound come from? Where does any experience come from? And come from. Even if you're a physicist, you ultimately rely on reading. You're looking at a voltmeter, you're looking at a gauge, right? You're looking at a cloud track. Well, in all cases, your observation is mediated by your conscious experience. So consciousness comes prior to anything else. And if we claim that science can explain everything, then it has to have a coherent, lawful, empirically testable explanation for the most fundamental fact of my existence and your existence, namely the fact that we're conscious.
And so if it were the case that consciousness of each and every individual was accessible by other individuals in this sort of fanciful realm of today, but maybe it will be available in the world of the future. Would you feel the pull of the mystery of consciousness just as strongly? Because that's not really the origin of the issue. The origin is the fundamental place that experience comes from.
It would be a different universe if I can directly access other people's mind, right? Because that's the tragedy of our life in some sense. You can live with someone your entire life. You can make love to them, so your bodies are interpenetrating. But when you look at her eyes, you fundamentally don't know what she is thinking, right? Because all you or he are thinking, what they are thinking or feeling, right? Because fundamentally, you only have behavior. You have the blushing of the skin. You have, you can see how your partner responds or what they say, but ultimately you don't know what they really feel. And would the mystery lessen? Maybe not, because even if I could access your mind, that still gives rise to the questions: why do we have minds at all?
Yeah.
And who else has mind? This little artifact that the student gave me, right, at the dragon, does this have mind? Well, most people would say not. But what about this, right? This is now beginning to be a little bit more complicated. Maybe this thing has mind. So we still need to understand how mind comes into the world. And by the way, I deal a lot with patients that have lost consciousness. So these are so-called behavioral unresponsive patients, let's say following a stroke, a cardiac arrest, or major brain traumatic injury. They're in the ICU, they're alive, they're on a ventilator support, but they're unresponsive. And if you get that call, right, your loved one is in this state, the first thing you ask, are they alive? Clearly. The next thing is, are they there? You want to know, because it's so important to us and to them. Are they feeling? Are they experiencing? Maybe they're in pain, or maybe they don't have any experience. It's really critical, important to know. So if you're not conscious, nothing matters. Tonight, Brian, particularly in the early night of the sleep, you're going to go into a state of sleep called deep sleep, when you have these regular slow waves crisscrossing your cortex. You do not exist for yourself. In deep sleep, in true deep sleep, you don't exist for yourself. You still exist for others. Your sleeping body is still there, but you don't exist for yourself. And then later on in the night, you'll wake up inside your sleeping body and you have these bizarre experiences we call dream. Again, then you matter again for yourself. So in some sense, consciousness is the most precious, is the only form of true existence we have in this universe.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, not that we want to go down this trajectory too far, presumably, but there was a period of my life when I perhaps thought too much about consciousness. I've never worked on it as a professional as you have, but I've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about it. And when I would go to sleep at night, thinking about the transition to that place of non-existence, I would become terrified. And I would, in that moment of transition, I would sort of wake up startled, like almost like I was dying, was the feeling. So I certainly understand, that divide between us being here and it mattering and us somehow not being there.
And that's the most fundamental divide between anything in the universe, a great divide of being, Giulio Tononi calls it, between things that matter for themselves, whether that's you and I, or a baby, or my Bernese mountain dog, and those things, presumably like this, that don't matter to themselves. Yeah. They matter to others, like to me or to the person who gave it to me, but they don't matter to themselves. It's the most fundamental distinction.
Yeah. Now, part of the mystery of consciousness, at least, thinking as many people do intuitively, but certainly as many physicists do from professional training, when you think about the brain as composed of some collection of particles and some configuration that we can do our best to describe using classical physics or quantum physics, it doesn't really matter. But somehow, when a collection of particles are arranged correctly or carrying out the right process or in the right structure, it yields this inner world. And it's hard to understand how particles can do that. But is that too much of a reductionist perspective to make headway on the issue?
Well, that's a classical perspective I also have. I mean, we are pieces of furniture of the universe. We're subject to the same laws as everything else. Black holes are viruses. So presumably viruses and black holes don't have this inner aspect. So why do we have inner aspects, and who else has it? No, I don't think that's one particular way of looking at it. So it's physicalism, materialism, right? There's physics, including my body. And so the big question there, how does consciousness arise? And of course, this is the big challenge to physicalism, that it's so far, despite the best attempt of Dan Dennett and the Churchlands and all these other philosophers to explain how consciousness comes about, they have not succeeded, right? This is where it is not, so far, we have no idea. It's as mysterious as taking a brass lamp, rubbing it, and suddenly a genie appears, right?
Yeah. And so when you began your work on consciousness, were you approaching it from a reductionist view? Was that your starting point? And have you evolved, I gather, into a different perspective since then?
Okay, so I started this way back with Francis Crick. I was a grad student in Germany, the Max Planck in Tübingen when I first met him, and then when I became a postdoc at MIT at the AI lab, I met him again, and we spent since then we worked continuously for 16 years, and we both started with the assumption that consciousness has to be explained. It's a real thing. We didn't buy in any of these attempts of philosophers to gaslight us. That's essentially what people like Dan Dennett, bless his soul, and other philosophers have done. They essentially gaslight us into believing consciousness doesn't really exist. The phenomenal aspect, this is a technical term, the subjective phenomenal aspect, the painfulness of pain, or the pleasure, what makes pleasure pleasure, what makes space extended, what makes a moment in time flow. Those things don't really exist. We're just confused about it. We said, no, that's wrong. This is obviously BS. It's the most fundamental thing I need to explain. But we're also scientists, and we've done very well, both individually as well as collectively, by doing reductionist science. So can we use that same approach to identify, firstly, a very mundane problem? What are the bits and pieces of the body in general, and more specifically of the brain, because we now know it's not the heart, right? You don't love someone with your heart. You love someone with your hypothalamus or with your amygdala or something like that. So it's much better for Valentine to give you a sweet hypothalamus piece chocolate rather than
have you tried that? Have you tried
No,
that?
it doesn't. No, and I don't think it would work very well. But so which bits and pieces of the brain are critically involved in any one conscious experience, like the conversation we're having right now is a perfect example, right? I see you, you see me, I hear you, you hear me, but we have we hear these voices in our head. So do we need, for example, do we need the ear? Or to see something, do we need the eye? No, because I can close my eyes and I can still sort of have a ghostly image of you. And tonight, of course, I might well dream about this interview, and dreams, as you and we all know, are as real as life, right? I can't tell in most dreams that I'm dreaming because it feels totally convincing. So we know you don't need the eye. Right? You don't need the ear. You don't need the periphery. You don't need your spinal cord, famously, right? If you're quadriplegic, you can't move. You're confined to a wheelchair, but you can still see and hear and dream and fear and dread and want and desire, all of that. Same thing, there's this little brain, so you probably have heard there are roughly 100 billion neurons in the human brain. 86 billion is the exact number, of which 69 are in this little brain at the back, the so-called cerebellum. So there are few people, it's rare, that are born without a cerebellum. They simply have a hole there. It's called agenesis of the cerebellum. Typically, these people are delayed. They don't talk till they're much later. They have various issues, but they're fully conscious. If you and I, this happens more frequently, have a tumor in the cerebellum, the surgeon has to go on and remove it. People complain, they become ataxic, they can't do this test anymore, they can't do this test anymore, right? Or this test anymore, or they sound like they're drunk and they can't walk precisely anymore, so they lose this smooth sensory motor integration. But none of them complains that they can't hear or can't see or don't have, can't love or fear anymore. Now that's 69 billion neurons, some of the most glorious, well-known neurons, the so-called Purkinje cell, these fan-shaped neurons are in there. Why does the cerebellum not have the magic? Well, two things are interesting about it. The cerebellum is primarily a feed-forward structure. In other words, it's one layer upon the next layer, just like a deep machine learning networks, an LLM. And also there's none of this recurrent excitation. So in what's typical of cortex, the outermost layer, if you excite there, you get all this reverberation and re-excitation, very complicated pattern. You don't have that in the cerebellum. In fact, I would say to a first approximation, your cerebellum is like a lookup table, a sophisticated, very precise lookup table that you need for sensory motor transformation primarily, but it doesn't seem to subserve consciousness. Okay, so that gives us some interesting clues. So you can sort of argue like that, and then now you can do experiments, for instance, where sometimes you see something like this, and sometimes I use psychophysical techniques called masking, where this becomes invisible. It's still present on my eye, but you don't directly see it. So you can try to do all sorts of experiments to try to understand what is the link between the physical stimulus and actually seeing something. And thereby you can track the footprints of consciousness throughout the brain. And today, hundreds of labs are doing this. This is called the neuronal correlate of consciousness, or NCC. Where are the NCCs for hearing, for seeing, for any form of consciousness?
Now, when you look at one of those neural correlates of consciousness, presumably as you look at it, it's still as opaque as to why it yields the feeling or the vision or the sound, that inner experience, right? I mean, there's no clue that would be the result of whatever's happening in that part of the brain.
That's entirely correct. So ultimately so in the fullness of time, this question, and I had this bet, with Dave Chalmers, the philosopher of mind, that in 25 years from when we did this back in 1998, we would identify, the field would agree on these are the neural correlates. Well, okay, I was naive. That was way too short an estimate. But, and I admitted defeat. I gave him 6 good bottles of Madeira. But he admits this is an entirely doable, empirical reductionist project. In the fullness of time, sooner or later, we know that those neurons involving this mechanism, maybe even quantum mechanics, we can talk about that, although right now we don't really have any evidence for that. But these physical things in this part of the brain using those genes, are the footprint of consciousness. But as you said, well, why? So for that, you need a theory. Finally, we need a theory that tells us from some fundamental principle what is consciousness, how does it emerge, and then can explain, okay, does the theory explain why this particular NCC is of this form and in this animal or in that person is of that form?
And so many people have tried to write down theories. I mean, at various times I've read through many of them. I don't know, maybe as many as 10 different variations on an approach that tries to give some anchor to our thinking about how the phenomenal inner world can emerge. You presumably have not been convinced by any of those, because for a long time you and Giulio Tononi, who you already mentioned, have been developing a radically different approach, I would say. Many of the others share not details, but they all share starting with the physical structure, looking at the computations or the signals, and trying to argue that from that we can extrapolate to some kind of inner world. But you go the opposite direction, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's correct. So one of the earliest hypotheses, and you'll see how this connects, that Francis and Crick I had, in fact, in our first paper we wrote together back in 1990, we said at the time people had discovered, or actually rediscovered, something that people had already noted in the 1920s, that in animals and then later on in people, whenever they're conscious of something, you can pick up this 40 hertz oscillation. So either EEG, or you put an electrode into the brain of patient or of animals, you can see neurons tend to fire, every 20 or 25 milliseconds, 40 hertz. Or in EEG, you can see activity. It's also called gamma activity. And so we made this proposal, okay, maybe this 40 hertz is a signature of consciousness, okay? And that remains somewhat controversial. But let's just accept that as a fact. Well, so why should that be true? Why not 30 hertz? Why not 50 hertz? Is it maybe 42, the answer to life, the universe, and everything else, including consciousness? So again, so most people, what most theories want to do, they say, well, consciousness, as you said, has a particular function, like planning or working memory, or like the global workspace. It's a particular aspect of an architecture, or there is a particular signature, like 40 hertz or some other aspects of the brain. And so that's a little bit like taking the brain and squeezing the brain or its function or its computation and saying, well, that is what consciousness is. And then you're always left with this problem: why this function? Why this behavior? Why this particular computation? So all of these theories, they buy into something in philosophy called functionalism. Right? So in particular, this is called Turing functionalism or computational functionalism, that essentially says consciousness has one or more functions, and those functions can be instantiated on a Turing machine, like the brain, for instance. And so that once you explain that function, you explain not only why the brain is conscious, because it carries out this function, but then you also say, well, thereby, if I carry out the same function on a computer, eo ipso, that computer will also be conscious. And that always faces a hard problem. Why this function and not that function? Why this behavior and not that behavior? And so the integrated information theory, particularly of the psychiatrist and neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, takes a very different stance. It's much closer in spirit to Leibniz or maybe Spinoza. It starts out from consciousness. It says consciousness is primary. You have to start with the fact that consciousness exists. It's just a fact that you and I know, and every conscious being know. And then you have to say, well, what are some of its properties that any conscious experience has to have, no matter, whether it's out of body or under psychedelic or near-death experience, no matter what the experience is, it exists intrinsic for itself, for this conscious system itself. It is specific. It is whatever it is. So it's not vague. It's very specific. Even when I'm driving in the fog, in the mountains, it is very specific, a foggy landscape that I'm seeing. It's integrated. It's holistic. It's one. It's not two separate experiences. It's structured. For instance, in this experience that right now we have, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's distance. Right? So it's any experience is highly structured, and then it has this very specific content. It's definite. Okay, it's not indefinite. It's very definite. There are things right now that are contained in my experience, particularly visual and auditory. Although I can also transfer my attention to my body, and I feel now, if I wanted to, the chair. I'm sitting in a chair, but typically I'm so focused on our conversation that I'm not aware of that. So it is that definite experience. So then the theory takes one additional axiom. It says, it makes a very specific statement, which is extremely unusual. It has a statement about existence. What exists? This goes back to a comment by Socrates in a Plato dialogue. What exists has to have causal powers. Okay, so the idea is, if I don't have causal power on anyone, nothing can make a difference to me, and I cannot make a difference to anything else, and I may as well not exist. To the extent that I have causal powers upon others, the more I exist, and consciousness, according to IIT, is causal power of a system upon itself. What I mean by that, you take a system like my brain or like a computer or like a sun or any other physical system, and in its present state, it has a certain, if it's a lawful system, it will move to the next state with some degree of regularity. Or it comes from its past state to the current state with some degree of regularity. For brains, that's highly, highly regular, because our brains are highly structured. They have lots of causal powers that are instantiated in the axons and the neurons and the synapses and all of that. And so the theory says any system that has causal power upon itself is conscious, and if it obeys those 5 properties of consciousness, it's an intrinsic, it's specific, it's definite, it's one, and it's structured, then that system is conscious, What is it conscious of? The theory says you have to unfold its causal powers. So you have to look at all of its individual parts, let's say its neurons or transistors, and try to understand the action of those 2 transistors on that in the next step, and those 10 neurons on those 50 neurons. And you have to do that exhaustively. And if you unfold that, as it were, conceptually, that is what the conscious experience is. It's identical. It's a very strong claim. It's an identity claim that my conscious experience maps 1-to-1 on the intrinsic causal power of its substrate, in this case, in the brain. And it also assigns a number with that. It's called integrated information. It's a number, phi, the Greek number phi, that can be between 0 and an arbitrary positive number. If it's 0, the system, strictly speaking, doesn't exist for itself. It's fully reducible to a set of smaller systems. The bigger it is, the more irreducible it is. It's another way of defining what a whole is and what a system is irreducible. And the bigger the number, that's the quantity of consciousness. And the qualia, the way it feels, is this unfolded causal effect power. Now, this all sounds very airy-fairy. I fully well understand.
No, obviously, everyone watching should know everything that you're describing has been laid out in mathematical detail in research papers. And I've read some of those papers and done my best to try to grapple. But I think the audience is getting the gist of it, obviously, from what you're describing. But a couple of questions occurred to me, which causal power seems to be essential to the program. And as a physicist, of course, when I think of causal power, I think of the fundamental forces that we're aware of: gravity, electromagnetism, strong, weak nuclear forces, and so forth. So the causal power that you envision, or actually I should say require consciousness to exert, is it exerted through those fundamental forces?
Yes.
Is it separate from those forces?
No. So if I have 2 particles of mass, they exert causal power on each other, but not on itself. On each other. So in my brain, causal power is instantiated, as I said, by primarily electromagnetism, classical physics, right? You have electrical fields, you have gradients, you have diffusion, ions bind, right? So it's all physics. So the causal powers are instantiated by the physics of the particular substrate. Presumably primarily classical physics, but they may also, we can talk about that, may involve quantum mechanical and phenomena.
So just so I understand, so when you think about consciousness in, say, a human brain, the one example that we're most familiar with, you do not envision consciousness preceding or existing independent of the substrate, right? Is that a correct statement?
Without the substrate, so let's be very clear on this. Within IIT, if you have no substrate, there's no consciousness. And IIT takes no specific ontological state position on what type of substrate. It's very operational. All it says, there's some stuff, brains, whatever, hydrodynamic, whatever, and I can observe and manipulate. So I can observe these states, and I can manipulate by using, electrical electrodes or chemicals or drugs or whatever. So it says any substrate that I can observe and manipulate, I can in principle fully define the system using its transition probability matrix. In principle, in practice, it's like I have to fully characterize the system. But you give me a system at some level of granularity, and I say, okay, at this level of granularity, let's say neurons for the sake of arguments, and now I write down the complete transition probability matrix of the system. Okay, these 5 neurons are on at time t, then at time t plus 1, those 10 neurons will be firing. And then at time t plus 2, those neurons will be firing. Then I can, in principle, and you can download, from the website integratedinformationtheory.org, you can download code that'll precisely calculate to what extent is a system integrated, has a phi different from 0, and in principle to unfold its causal power. So there's not, in that sense, there's nothing magical or woo-woo about this. Of course, it's a theory, it may be wrong, but there's nothing, it's all very concrete, expressed in operationalized terms that as a physicist, you're very familiar with.
So when you say that you start with consciousness, that's not committing in philosophical language to a distinct ontology where consciousness is somehow among the fundamental ingredients or entities. Rather, it still is the physical stuff that a physicist like me would talk about. But
No, because no textbook of general relativity or quantum mechanics, except maybe in the very end, as a footnote, talks about consciousness. General relativity doesn't talk about consciousness. The quantum mechanics doesn't talk about it outside the measurement problems, right?
sure.
Chemistry doesn't talk about it. Biology doesn't talk about it. But here we are. We are all conscious. So no, this is. I mean, you've exactly put your finger on it. This is the problem that you assume that first and what exists and foremost is stuff, matter, energy, space, time, and then somehow consciousness emerges in ways that we have no freaking idea how from it? Or do you say no? Firstly, at least from an epistemic point of view, what I know about, you see, I don't know about atoms, right? You don't know about atoms
Correct.
or black holes. I have to infer them by reading textbooks, by doing experiments in 101 undergrad physics lab. The only thing I directly know about, as philosophers say, the only thing I've direct acquaintance with is seeing, is hearing, is dreaming, etc. So purely empirical. Forget about philosophy. That has to be my starting point. That's the only thing I really know for sure. René Descartes, cogito ergo sum.
But if consciousness is exerting its causal power through the physical ingredients that instantiate it, so if you're not introducing other forces beyond, we don't know that we know all the forces, but for argument's sake, let's just talk about the four that we focus upon. If consciousness is exerting its causal influence through those forces, is it, where am I going wrong if I think about consciousness as emerging from the ingredients when they're composed or structured or organized in a manner that gives a significantly large value of phi, significantly large value of integrated
Well,
information?
then you're adopting dualist language emerging. So that's a little bit like the Holy Ghost, right? So we have the waters of the brain, and then you do something and they light up. The brain's the most complex piece of active matter. And then a bubble emerges, feeling of pain or pleasure of seeing you. Okay, but now you have to, what's the relationship between this thing? It's obviously different from the underlying brain, right? My brain there's no light in there. It's pretty dark inside my skull, right? So, but here I am, I'm seeing things. So it seems to be something very different, right? And then
Yes.
you ask the question, well, how does it relate to matter? And is this really the old Cartesian, okay, there's material stuff, res extensa, anything that has extension, generalized to modern physics, and then there's cognitive stuff. So then we're really talking about a dualist viewpoint, which most people have had throughout most of history, right? But most scientists are very uncomfortable with, or philosophers, because then you get what's called the interaction problem. How does this mental stuff interact, go back from the mental to the physical to make me, for example, raise my hand? How can it do that, right? And in fact, this was pointed out to René Descartes in his correspondence with the Princess of Bohemia. She pointed this out to him already 400 years ago. So that's one way. The other way is to express some sort of idealism that maybe. So you asked the metaphysical question. So we just discussed dualism. That said, essentially two sorts of stuff. There's physical stuff and there's mental stuff. Physicalism says, of course, the only thing that really exists is physical stuff. Although we can talk about it, what the physical is has gotten very complicated, right? With ERP and entangled belts, pair, and all of that. What is the physical? It's certainly not my grandfather's materialism anymore, right? In the modern world. Or you can say idealism. Maybe, but this is now beyond IIT, maybe what truly exists, the only thing that you and I are familiar with is the mental. And the physical, this stuff, ultimately is a manifestation of something mental. This used to be a very big, many people believe this. Schopenhauer is probably the most, and Hegel in the European tradition, the most famous philosophers associated with it, and is now strangely making a comeback in philosophy of mind.
Now, I know you're not a great fan of categorizing integrated information theory, but since you did raise those various historical ways. Where does IIT fit in that categorization?
Well, it shares intuition with both panpsychism and with idealism and with dualism, but it's neither. It's a scientific theory. It can be proven wrong if what I'm conscious of, the neural substrate, the NCC, is not the maximum of cause effect power, then the theory is wrong. But it shares with panpsychism the insight that many systems beyond us are maybe conscious. In fact, consciousness may possibly extend through many parts or maybe even all parts of the tree of life. Because even if you look at a single cell, Brian, if you look at a single cell, paramecium, there are roughly 10,000 different proteins, right? 8,000 genes, etc. Probably billions of individual proteins interacting in an amazingly complex way that no one so far has ever managed to model. Well, that's a lot of complexity, a lot of causal power. So maybe it feels a little bit to be a cell, and once you put antibiotic on there on the cell membrane dissolves and the paramecium dies, it doesn't feel like anything anymore. Or maybe it goes even down further, maybe even in the limit little particles, nucleons, for instance, have phi that's a little bit different from zero. Just like there's a little bit of heat in outer space, right, 2.75 degrees Kelvin, maybe there's a little bit of phi. So IIT shares intuition with that, but IIT is also different. For example, IIT says very specifically, a dune, if you take a huge mountain of sand, that dune or piece of furniture or this, yes, it may be true that the individual atoms have a phi that's tiny bit different from zero, but just putting a collection of those particles together does not make consciousness, does not exist at the level of this dragon. My liver, although the individual cells may, in isolation, may be conscious, once you put a billion of them together or 10 billions to form my liver, that liver does not automatically, because it's an aggregate, does not automatically acquire consciousness. It really depends on the causal interaction among the aggregates. And most aggregates are simply aggregates. They're not conscious by themselves. It shares some features with dualism in a sense. It says, yeah, there is this intrinsic, the inner view. So things like brains have inner view, the way it feels like, and have an outer view, like, what an outside scientist can tell. But it's different from that. And it says, yeah, you can study the brain using good old physics, but it's not identical with physicalism.
And so when you, though, speak of the key property of this causal power, if you take a system that has a small amount of phi, but non-zero amount of phi, would you say that I'm able to fully describe the behavior of that system using my third-party perspective, using the laws of physics as we know them, or as they will one day be formulated? Let's not commit one way or the other. Is that enough to describe the behavior of that system with a small amount of phi, or does the small amount of consciousness yield a small amount of causal power that somehow I need to take into account to understand the behavior of this system?
It's the latter. It's that system, if it has sufficient causal power, so it exists as a whole with phi different from zero, even small, it feels like something to be that system. Now, in principle, if you have an exhaustive description of this system, you may have read these days people manage to obtain the connectome of the fruit fly, right? Was in, front page New York Times. 140,000 neurons. Okay, so it's a tiny fruit fly. Most people don't think about it. It's one of the best studied model organisms. It has 140,000 neurons, and presumably in the central body of it, the central part of its brain called the central body is amazingly complex. And because it grew up under this evolutionary pressure, it has to fly. Its neurons are vastly more compact and incredibly complicated compared to the human brain. Although the human brain is much bigger, I'm pretty confident that connectome will yield a phi different from zero. So in principle, if you have the connectome, in principle at least, you can compute it what it is experiencing. Presumably something simple about vision, optical flow, about its food, its need for food, but it also has these insects also have some of the hormones like we have, like oxytocin, etc. So it may feel good on some days when it's in the sun, it's just fed, and may feel bad on other days. In principle, you could derive that from an exhaustive description of its brain.
But if I'm looking at a simpler system, because that would be wonderful if we could actually do the calculations, but it's beyond anything we can do. But for a simpler system with a small amount of phi, integrated information theory would predict that the laws of physics would make wrong predictions for the behavior of that system because the laws of physics don't take account of the causal influence of...
No. It doesn't conflict with physics. Physics would predict certain things would happen, but it would leave out what it feels like to be that.
I see. So the causal influence that you're talking about is purely internal. It has no external manifestation in a system with non-zero phi.
No, in my case, for example, I can talk about it. So clearly, in my case, for big brains like us that can reflect upon it, the fact that we can have a conversation about consciousness, right, clearly means that consciousness affects my behavior. And you have to explain that. Now, you can, in principle, you might well be able to explain that just assuming I'm an automaton and not assuming anything about my inner state, just doing, good old biophysics, tracing back all the causal influences. I don't think that would be feasible, right? Except if you know about motivations, which are partly conscious, partly unconscious, etc. So you raise an interesting question I haven't really thought about. To what extent, if you don't know, well, I mean, one fundamental problem is one of the earliest experiments I did when I worked for in grad school to make some money. I programmed this labyrinth with fruit flies, in fact, with flies. And they had to go into this labyrinth with all these branch points. And what you see, the fly comes to a branch point. Let's say 20% go left, 30% go right, 20% sit, and the remaining, 30% turn back. And it's impossible to predict, given all the indeterminacy and all the noise, what each animal will predict, will actually do. So in practice, there are fundamental limits to even the simplest of all systems, leaving aside, of course, Heisenberg and quantum mechanical indeterminacy. There's fundamental limits of what you can predict. So I'm not saying IIT predicts anything at odds with physics. No. It's just that physics leaves out this aspect of reality.
But what's confusing to me is if we look at a continuum of systems, or it doesn't have to be continuum, you just look at a sequence of systems from you or me, we have a large value of phi, and the causal influence of consciousness allows us to do all sorts of things. I mean, consciousness is really manifest in our external behavior. As we go down to smaller and smaller values of phi, that external manifestation is still there. It just becomes less and less.
Yes.
But there should be a system that we can calculate what it should do based on the absence, our assumption of the absence of any phi or inner world, any conscious, power. We should be able to predict how it behaves, but that should differ from what you would say, because you have an additional influence that we're ignoring.
Well, the question is that causal or not? Let's take a problem closely related to that, free will. Okay?
Yeah. Right. In fact, that's where I was going with this,
okay.
To tell you the truth.
All right. So IIT says you are free for certain types of decision. If you step on my foot and I instinctively pull my, reflex-like pull my foot back, that's not free will, right? If I'm drunk and do certain things, that's not free. But in the typical free will scenario, let's say you ask me a question, Brian, who are you going to vote for? Okay, let's see. And I think there's A and there's B, and A does this, and I don't like B because of that, and then I come to a decision. Okay, that's classical free will. Then I make a decision for whatever reasons, bias, conscious, unconscious, I make a decision. So IIT says that is as free as it gets, because the actual actor of this free will are the intrinsic causal powers. Now you can correlate, to get back to the physics. If you're just a physicist, you can say, well, I don't know about intrinsic causal powers. All I can say, if you push that button 200 milliseconds before, I can see this part of the brain go up or that part of the brain go down, right? Sort of a Libet type of experiment.
Yeah.
Okay, which is true on average, of course. But what do we teach our students? Correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation, right? Just because you can, that's true. Before I make this decision, other parts of my brain turn on or turn off. That's entirely true. It has to be like that, of course, because it's not suddenly, my conscious decision comes out of nowhere. But the real causal actors are sort of the intrinsic causal power. So it's called an intrinsic powers approach. The intrinsic powers, that's where the causal action happens. Although you as physicist, you can clearly trace the entire chain of events in principle, not in practice, of course. You can trace the entire chain of events back to, 200 seconds before, 200 milliseconds, or 1 second, or 10 seconds before.
But if I know again, we're talking hypothetical here, but these are real important issues, even though they're hypothetical, not things that we can carry out. But if I knew your quantum state, or if we're willing to just talk classically, because I think we agree that quantum mechanics is probably not of the essence to anything that we're talking about right here, because if it's a random outcome, that's not what we call free will and all that sort of stuff. So to avoid those issues, if I knew your state at a given moment, going back, hundreds of years, we've had this notion that if you know the state and you know the laws of physics, you know what's going to happen. There isn't anything else that intercedes in the lawful progression of, say, your particles from this moment in time to some future moment in time. And if that's the case, it's really hard to see where this freedom of will that you speak of has any causal power, because it's just the laws of physics acting themselves out on your particles. I do understand, though, if integrated information theory says, whoa, 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 there's something else going on here. It's called the causal power of consciousness, and it really does influence how things unfold. So you physicists are missing something if you just analyze at the level of the ingredients and the laws that allow those ingredients to evolve. So is that the way that you would describe how we would fail to truly understand how
You
you
would
develop?
misidentify the true causes of action. The true causes of action is not my supplement. So in the classical Libet experiment, you're watching a clock go around, and whenever you feel like it, you raise your right hand. And then, he did some
Sure.
nice psychophysics. He found, well, up to 1 second before you raised your hand randomly, you could see the signal in your prefrontal cortex. So of course, this is not a truly free, this is a random
Yes.
decision, right, to your point. But I think I grant that point, but it means you've identified some correlate, but not the true cause. So this is the difference between correlation and the true cause of a system. And that physics in this case would simply miss, because it says, well, it's only physics going on. There's nothing else. And we're not saying there's any additional laws.
Would we differ in the predictions, though? We might differ in the explanation for why you chose to go right versus left, or to raise your hand or not. As you're describing it, we would miss the true causal power of consciousness in yielding that outcome. But would we get the right outcome if, like we talk classically, would physics be missing anything? And it goes back to the question of, a small number of particles with a small amount of phi. If you tell me that a small amount of phi, that if I don't take that into account, I'll make the wrong predictions,
No
then I'll
physics.
understand.
No, to first order, our brains are relative determinate. Look, if you know me, all right, or if you infer something about me and what I do and where I live, you're going to be able to predict fairly accurately how I'm going to vote. Okay?
But I mean 100% accurately. I mean, hypothetically, putting
Well,
quantum mechanics to the side,
well,
that's the real
no, but
question here.
practically, no. And here we have to go back to limits of computation. We
Mm.
know that is simply not possible because, you get chaos. And in biology, this is the big challenge with biology. It's almost impossible to accurately compute, to predict anything or any sort of behavior, and even the simplest of all organisms, right? Let's see, C.
Yeah.
elegans, roundworms,
But
302 neurons.
I sort of see those as practical limitations. I'm sort of
Epistemic,
getting at,
the epistemic limitations.
yeah, are we actually missing some? In other words, I'm a strong believer in the absence of free will for the standard reasons, really, that when I look at you, I see a large collection of particles governed by physical law, And I know that you, Christof, do not have the power, I believe, to intercede in the lawful progression of those particles. And so you think
There
that,
does it again.
yeah. So,
It
so my
goes up.
question to you is, did you just violate the laws of physics?
No.
Or could I have in principle known that you were going to do that if I understood the state of your particles well
Yes.
enough and could do all those calculations?
Yes, in principle, yes, but you could have correlated, but you wouldn't have identified the true causes of it.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So I think we actually have a similar view because I use different language, but I like to say there's different layers, different levels of analysis. Some are more useful than others. The rock bottom reductionist account is a perfectly fine description. And right there, we see the absence of the traditional notion of free will, because if it's all particles governed by physical law, there's no way for us to intercede. And then there's a higher level description that's more useful, where we do talk about human motivations and desires and perspectives that influence what our brain is thinking, and therefore the conscious choices that we make. But those conscious choices are not as free as our intuition would suggest because of this physicalist reductionist account. Is there something in that you...
I would say they're not as free because we are strangers to our mind, and we simply don't understand the vast amount of unconscious biases. I mean, this is all
Sure.
what bias literature says, right? We're biased in all sorts of ways, useful or not useful, functional or dysfunctional, and we're not aware of that. So that's why I think we are less free, but we are free, I believe, and it's you can take an American, the American philosophical tradition of pragmatism. Right? If it helps me to lead a happier life, look, we are not going to. So I think you and I both agree that physics in principle can predict things, okay? But I would say it's not. It would leave out the true causes. You say, well, it practically speaking doesn't matter. Fine. So then I'm free to choose to believe in one or the other.
Sure.
And to me, believing that I'm actually the agent of cause, that I can make a difference in my life, that I'm not, the helpless victim of unseen systemic forces, leads me to be much more happier in my life.
Here, here. I agree. I agree completely. But let me just change gears for a moment, though. So you described integrated information theory a little while ago, and all of the aspects of the theory are eminently reasonable and comport with our own introspection of how it feels to be a human being and how our minds seem to function. Is introspection a dangerous tool to use? I know it's our only tool, so don't get me wrong. But for instance, you have described, and if we can go there, if you're interested and willing, your own psychedelic experiences, where the introduction of a little different molecule totally changes your experience and your introspective. So does that suggest that we should not put as much weight on our inner assessment of how the mind works?
We have to be careful in doing it, yes, because we know in the visual system, it's extremely well explored. There are all sorts of visual illusions, right? I can show you things, and what you see is not what's there, and what's there you don't see. So we know that, right? 100 years of visual or sensory psychophysics. But we also cannot neglect them, because then we neglect the central aspect of my life, that I'm conscious. Now, if you're uncomfortable with that because you like to have objective, only third person, then fine. But then you're going to live in a universe that leaves out everything really important about life, including your own life. If I tell you, Brian, look, here's $1 billion, I'm going to take from you. It's a gamble with the devil, right? I'm going to take your consciousness from you. But you'll be able to enjoy all the money, all the power you have, but you won't feel anything, okay? Would you take this bargain? Hell no. No.
Well, perhaps you should ask my wife. But yes, no, I certainly would not take that bargain.
I mean, I don't know anyone really, because this is ultimately what life is. It's a feeling of conscience. It's a feeling of life itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you have to be careful. So for example, when it comes, in fact, talking about psychedelics, why do people do psychedelics? They do psychedelics because they like to explore their consciousness, and they like to expand their consciousness, and they like to explore different states of consciousness. Again, this is not, if you don't believe in consciousness, this is not easily explainable. It's not, many psychedelics are not like, it's not like cocaine, or some of these other opiates, which give you this pure jolt of pleasure. They don't give, sometimes they are associated, like ayahuasca is associated with purging, with, you feel sick for the first 2 hours. So they're not so much pleasurable as revelatory, or they can show you very different aspects of your conscious experience. That's why people take it. So in each case, you have to be careful. But it's still, and many scholars have raised this question, going all the way back to The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, or even another 60 years earlier, The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James.
Yeah.
Can these extraordinary experiences that some people, so-called mystical experiences, that some people have had without any molecules. In fact, Brian, have you ever tried breath work?
I did. I went to an institute once where that was one of the activities, and I letting go is very difficult for me. So as I felt myself sort of leaving the usual control, I stopped. And so this is definitely an issue for me, and one that, frankly, I would like to go to the places that you describe, and maybe at some point I will go further than I have. But yes, I'm aware that you don't actually have to have
any
different
molecule.
molecules. Yeah,
all it takes, I just did this twice the last 2 weeks. It's amazing. All it takes is a circular breathing.
Yeah. I've
You
watched
do this
films of it for sure.
for 10 minutes, and after 10 minutes, you start getting dissociative, and then do another 5 minutes, and you reach these ecstatic states where you totally lost your sense of self. I just howl. I'm just this one. I love to channel dogs and wolves. You just howl, and you just feel at one with the universe without any drugs whatsoever. Okay, so and it's pretty lawful. You can get it in most, many people you can get it. It's not that everyone has a radical different experience. So that tells you there is something trustworthy about these intuition. If you and I do the same thing and we get similar experience, not the same, but very similar, then I can stick you in a magnet, or I can put EEG electrodes on you. I can see which part of the brain are activated or deactivated, etc. So all of that solidifies my belief in intuitions in the right way with proper cautions are incredible, valuable.
And what do you think those intuitions in psychedelics or in breath work, or in vigorous energetic drumming or dancing or twirling, there are many ways that people have tried to access a different state of being. Is it telling us something? Some would claim that it's telling us something about deep reality. I tend to think of it's telling us something about how this thing inside of our head responds to different stimuli, or different amount of oxygen, or different kind of physical activity.
But you haven't been there yet.
That's true. Yeah. So where do you come down?
And that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
That makes all the difference. There's this example of in the philosophy of mind, of Mary the color scientist. So it's a little bit variant, I'm telling you.
Yeah, I know that one well. Yeah.
So I'm telling you a variant. So imagine we all live in a black and white world. There's no color. Okay. And then for 2 hours, or let's say 1 hour, I do something. I breathe fast, or I take up psychedelics, and I see the world in color. I see yellow. I see blue. I see these colors. Okay. And then after an hour, it's gone again. Now, you can say, well, sorry, Christof, that was your brain on drugs. Or you can say, no, there is something with the world. There's really something with the world. There's this in color. Surfaces have it, independent of the illuminating light source. It's really there. And people say, no, it's just your brain on drugs. Okay, so that's the situation I find myself after. I was sitting on a beach in Bahia under the midnight southern sky, and suddenly I accessed what Huxley calls mind at large, which I'd never really taken seriously. I never thought about really seriously. And I knew, undisputable. William James calls it noetic knowledge. You bring back this knowledge, and I know, it's happened 2 years ago, that's how the world is. That's the ultimate reality. Now, of course, I could be deluding myself and all of that. All of that's true, and you don't have to believe it. I get that, but for me, it is. I have experienced the reality that underlies everything, and now the challenge is, because I'm still a thinker, I'm still a scientist, trying to reconcile my science, the thinking skills, whatever thinking skill I have, with this very unusual mystical experience. Well, I mean, it's not so. In terms of mystical experience, I just attended a conference in Philadelphia where half the room had similar type of mystical experiences, right? There's now big literature on this, on mystical experience with or without psychedelic breath work. People have it under all sorts of circumstances. And so I think it behooves us to try to understand what type of metaphysics is called for that doesn't say physicalism hasn't worked. Physicalism has worked spectacular well, but it's just very narrow. It only has a very narrow lens and leaves out a lot of other things. And so maybe we can come to a much larger, much better picture of reality.
And look, I'm not by any means any of those scientists who, look at or hear things of that sort and want to sort of push it aside as somehow mystical nonsense or something like that. I've not had the psychedelic version. I've had various moments here and there from other substances and also from nothing at all. I was once sitting in a Starbucks and I was overcome with the strangest sensation that somehow I loved humanity. And I've never had a feeling like that before. I've never had it since, but it resonated with things that I've since read about, where some people under the influence of certain kinds of unusual stimulation from psychedelics or otherwise have that sense of oneness. And so momentarily I've felt it, but I've always come back to thinking about it as something in here as opposed to something out there. And maybe that's an unnecessarily small interpretation because I've not had the fuller experiences that you're describing.
So you've never lost yourself?
Well, there was one instance. I won't go into detail. I spoke about it on Joe Rogan, an experience in Amsterdam where it wasn't psychedelics, but it was very strong for me because I don't do any drugs. I don't drink. That certainly took me to a place I'd never been before, which was terrifying. I will never do that again because I lost all connection to reality as I knew it. I felt as though the world was disintegrating around me. I felt like time itself was fractured. I'd look at a clock. I think like 10 hours had gone by and like 10 seconds had gone by. And so different, but yes, unusual in terms of comparison to everyday reality.
Okay, yeah, that would count as a, because I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for having mystical experience. You need lots of
I'm
help.
planning. I do imagine doing it. So how has your psychedelic experiences, I presume is more than once, or are they influencing your scientific investigations?
Well, I just recently did this book. This
Yeah.
title comes from the opera Tristan and Isolde of Richard Wagner, when the second act, they've drunk this love potion and now they want to merge with each other because they realize, he of course famously also wrote his own libretto, his own story, that Tristan is still Tristan but wants to be Isolde, and Isolde is still Isolde and wants to be Tristan. And then they essentially, under the most rapturous music in the Western canon, they become one and become one with the universe. So they have a classical mystical experience. And that's sort of what I had. And so the challenge I now have, I read a lot of the relevant literature to try to integrate this experience I had with everything else I know, including with, brain science. As I said, many people have had them. They have some degree of lawfulness, like, there are certain conditions that typically have to be. So typically they involve loss of self. They're typically spontaneous, although there are some techniques like breath work that can trigger them. They're typically short lasting, and they leave this feeling of noetic, that James calls noetic quality. You just know, you bring something back, and the experiences themselves feel more real than life itself, right? people routinely say, "Oh yeah, I've come now to the heart of things. This is really what it's all about." It's like you have sort of you have a function in your brain that computes the expectation and the difference between what I actually encounter and my expectation, like some free energy principle. And now here you're at an absolute minimum. This is what reality really is. And then you get back in everyday reality, and it doesn't quite feel the same. And so, can we have views of the universe that are compatible with that? And we can. There is, for example, this. Have you had on your show Bernardo Castro?
No, not spoken with him. I know of him. I don't know him personally.
Okay, he's very eloquent. So after my experience, I was so struck. I mean, I really felt that sort of, this was last year. So I was, 66. At this point in your life, your ontology is pretty well established. You know what you believe. But in 10 minutes, all of that changed. The plates of my ontologically underpinning suddenly gave way, left me in this morass, and I went out and spent 3 days. So he's a Dutch computer scientist. He has 2 PhDs in computer science and in philosophy, and he is an advocate for really a new version of Schopenhauer. He calls it, and he's very eloquent about it, analytical idealism. And so he says, look, what truly exists is the only thing we have direct acquaintance with. Is phenomenal. But that's the only thing that ultimately exists. And this entire world that can be studied by science, there's no question about it, that follows natural laws. Again, there's no question about it. There's no God or anything supernatural involved in this. Ultimately, this physical world is a manifestation of something mental. And the challenge is to explain, I don't access your mind, right? And you don't access my mind. I mean, that's why we have to talk rather than directly doing some sort of mind meld. And why not? If there's only one mind, why should we not be able to? But then, you said in a Starbucks, suddenly you felt, connected with everyone. Under psychedelics, you suddenly feel this interconnected feeling with the entire universe. So it maybe on a special stage, the brain is able to access this ultimately mind. And so then that begs the question, what is it? Can we induce it experimentally? Can I do this in a lawful, routine way without doing psychedelics or sitting in a Starbucks? Not that I have anything against Starbucks. It's a great Seattle company.
And so do you think that, and we've mentioned it before, but we sort of put it to the side, is quantum mechanics at all essential here? Again, many people have written about quantum mechanics in ways that I find really unpleasant and unpalatable. Investing in quantum mechanics, a certain kind of conscious mystery that we who work in the field don't see within the equations at all. But for instance, if we had a classical world, could there be consciousness, or does it somehow intrinsically rely upon quantum mechanics? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I don't think anybody knows, but.
Okay, yeah, we don't know, A. B, IIT certainly works perfectly well, doesn't require any quantum mechanical substrate. It works in a classical world. And you and I agree, the brain is wet and warm. And so it's not a very likely candidate for, finding things superposition. However, and I've written about that, however, anything that's not ruled out by the laws of physics might potentially be exploited by natural selection, right? That's been operating continuously for 3.5 billion or 4 billion years on this planet. So right now, I got together with this Hartmut Neven. So he's the physicist, also German physicist, who runs the head of the quantum compute group of Google. They built what they call Sycamore. They built their 80 qubit quantum computers that, by the way, operate at 25 millikelvin. So that's 100 times colder than outer space, which of course is, another 100 times colder than this temperature. So 10,000 times colder. However, there's a few interesting anomalies. Like, it has been claimed that xenon, the rare gas that has 8 outer electrons, so it doesn't really interact with anything much, is an anesthetic. This is well known. This is not controversial. You can use it to anesthetize people. It has some advantages, but it's also very expensive, and it causes people to get nauseated. So that's a drawback. But the claim is that xenon 128, 129, 132, and 133, so different isotopes that all have the exactly same 8 outer electrons, have different anesthetic potencies. Okay, and curiously enough, the ones that have low anesthetic potency have nuclear spin 1/2, and the other ones have spin 0. So we are currently doing with collaborators in Santa Barbara and in Buckinghamshire in England, we're trying to test in flies and in human pluripotent stem cells, as well as in primary culture. Is this true? It's a purely empirical question. Is it true that xenon isotopes have differential effects on the ability of these neurobiological systems to be anesthetized?
I see.
If they do, again, purely empirical question, it would be a real head scratcher, because it's not clear how nuclear spin that's inside the nucleus totally shielded by all of its electrons, why that should matter. So I think it's unlikely than not, given the wet and warm brain, but we can't rule it out.
Right. Another question that I just wanted to run by you. When you calculate phi, the integrated information for a given system, you were saying that many systems have zero if it's just particles floating through empty space. Some have non-zero if there's a certain kind of structure there. Our brains have higher values. What about systems that seem to be not conscious but are artificially imagined or constructed? I think Scott Aronson wrote down one or something where the value of phi is really big. Do you interpret that as this system that, whatever is a collection of circuits, I forget the details that he wrote down. Do you view it as having consciousness, an inner world?
Well, if IT is true, yes. However, so the particular transformer architecture, this matrix architecture Scott Aronson proposed, would be very simple. It could just be spatially extended but vast. It would just feel spatial extent. So it would be like looking at a totally empty blank wall that has no content whatsoever. Yeah, this is entirely possible. I mean, look, the theory that mammals we know that whales are not fish, but actually mammals, although it's very unintuitive, right? They swim in the water, they smell fishy, but they're not fish, they're mammals, right? So this is a strange prediction, or black holes and GR and all of that. It's a strange prediction. Finally, we have to see. There are more interesting predictions. So for instance, your brain and my brain, as we just talked, I don't access your mind, I don't access you don't access my mind. Now we can start connecting. We can start doing what's called brain bridging, where I have one wire from my visual cortex to your visual cortex, from your auditory cortex to my auditory cortex, etc. And then I add more and more wires. So at some point, I would see it's like augmented reality. So I would see this scene, but then I would also see the world as seen through your eyes, right? Ghostly superimposed. But I would still be me, and you would still be you. The theory says, at a precise point when the integrated information across our two brains, given all the wires, exceeds the phi of your brain or of my brain, at that point, abruptly, you can add one axon, boom. Abruptly now, it's an extremum principle. I disappear, you, Brian, disappear. There is this new entity, this amalgamation, this Ubermind of Brian Christof, that speaks through two mouths, that has four eyes, 4 legs, etc., and that would combine both your mind and my mind. And then as soon as I cut that connection again, we fall back. And this is really the inverse of what happens in a split brain experiment. We have two hemispheres, there are 200 million fibers called the corpus callosum that connect the left and the right, and sometimes the surgeon has to cut them because to prevent seizures. They still do that today, to prevent seizures. And then, as far as we can tell, if I cut right now your corpus callosum, if I divide your brain this way, there would be two entities. I could typically only talk to the left one, because that's, in most of us, that's where language is, not in all, but in most of us. But your right one would also be conscious. There would be two conscious entities, but then once you connect them, the integrated information here exceeds the integrated information here and there. And this is an experiment that we can probably do in a few years from now in small animals like flies, or maybe even in a mouse.
Amazing. That would be amazing. And what about artificial consciousness, not artificial intelligence per se? Certainly, I think I've read, and it makes sense to me, that if you calculate phi for a digital computer that's attempting to simulate a brain, phi is much smaller for it than it would be for the human brain by virtue of the way that our digital computers are constructed. But you could, of course, imagine an artificial version, not a digital computer, that really is based upon the way our brains operate, but is created by human beings as opposed to by, gestation. I guess we create human brains too, but not in the manner that I'm describing now. In the laboratory, we could create this. Is there any obstacle in principle to creating that kind of an artificial mind?
You're very good. No, for exactly the reason you mentioned. So let's take something concrete. GPT-4 Turbo, right? The latest, or what is it? O1, the latest
Yeah.
version of GPT. When you talk to it or interact with it, it's amazing. You can ask it all sorts of questions. You can ask it, how do you feel about this? Or how would you respond if this were to happen? It can tell you in great detail, really stunning, right? But that's, of course, because it's read all of human literature and it regurgitates that, right, in a brilliant way, right? Not because of it has any real experiences. And why does IIT say that? Because, as you said, you have to look actually at the substrate, not at the simulation. Right? So even if you simulate a human brain, yes, you can simulate all the connectivity, but actually you have to go under the hood, right? You have to open the hood and see, well, actually, where does the physical action happen? It happens at the level of the CPU or the TPU or ALU, where you have one transistor and the electric charge on one transistor, right, that moves to the other gates and opens those gates, etc. And given the radical different architecture, those things. So right now, the digital computers in the cloud are not conscious, and they won't be conscious in another 10 or 20 years. However, you are right. There's nothing magical about the brain, right? There's nothing supernatural about the human brain. And so were we to build what's called a neuromorphic computer that some people are trying to do, that follows the same connectivity principle as a human brain, or possibly even with quantum computers, right? Because if you can really entangle a million bits, and they're all intertangled, right, 2 to the million, that is effective vast connectivity, and that probably has, depends on the details, and you have to look at the actual math, but that may have very high connectivity. So it's well possible that we can engineer systems that have actually artificial consciousness and not just artificial intelligence. But I'm
Yeah.
less concerned about that. The concern really is intelligence, right? Because what you can do with that intelligence. Because intelligence is ultimately about doing. Consciousness is about being. It's about being. It's a state.
But if you imagine these doomsday scenarios, these dystopian scenarios where an artificial intelligence somehow so exceeds us, this traditional story that we become irrelevant, and wittingly or not, this artificial system somehow causes our extinction, presumably we would be happier, if that's the right adjective, probably not, if that artificial intelligence had artificial consciousness too, because otherwise the thing that takes over and maybe it creates a paradise here on earth, it doesn't experience it. It's like that $1 billion deal that you suggested to me earlier. It would be an empty world filled with beings creating maybe beautiful art, beautiful music, operas, but having no inner experience of it.
Erwin Schrödinger has this beautiful sentence: a universe without consciousness is like a play without an audience. Yeah, no one is experiencing anything. There's furious action, because that's what intelligence involves, right? Furious action, but no experience whatsoever. Yeah, it's a pretty depressing scenario.
Yeah. So one final question, or set of questions. Do you fear the end of your consciousness? Do you fear death?
Wow, that's a I have a pretty sunny disposition, but as you get older, and this is probably not foreign to you or members of the audience, you can't sleep as well as you get older, and you sometimes lie in bed and wonder, you can't sleep. You wonder about what happens after I'm dead. You wonder about eternity and what that really means. And then you get this vertigo, you get this existential vertigo. It's like looking down. I used to be a rock climber. It's like looking down into an abyss, but the abyss has no bottom, right? And it's really terrifying, and it's quite useless because, you don't reach any new insight or conclusion, but you can't help yourself. And then I had this near-death experience with which I opened this book, Then I, Myself, the World. And one benefit, it was horrifying, just like your experience in Amsterdam. I'll never, ever do anything like that again. It was just horror. Well, it was a weird state of horror and ecstasy. But it gave me the gift that I only realized like weeks later. I realized this was in the first week of the pandemic. I said, hey, wait a minute. I haven't had one thought about death, and this has now been almost 4.5 years. I haven't once thought, I know I'm going to die. I don't deny that, and I don't want it. It's not that I want to die now, but it doesn't bother me. I've accepted it. So it's
And what was it about the experience that made the change?
Well, so this is not uncommon. So if you talk to people with near-death experiences, which are well, they can be related to mystical experience, but very often they're different from. So it's like a Venn diagram. Here's mystical and here's near-death experiences. It's not uncommon that people have this loss of fear of death. I don't know. It's that certainly in my near-death experience, there was no Christof. There was no body. There was no self. There was no ego. Nothing like that. I wasn't a person or a male or female or a child or an animal or God or anything. I just was. Maybe I can't quite explain it. One explanation is that psychologists have advanced, because now you see the mind at large. But I didn't encounter mind at large. This mind at large experience of mine came many years later. So I don't know. All I can say is a psychological fact. Since my NDE, I've completely lost this fear of death.
And you do feel, though, that with death, with the end of the substrate, your consciousness will end too. Is that accurate with the perspective you take now?
My egoic consciousness.
Your what?
Egoic.
Ego.
Christof will die. If my brain dies, or gets injured enough, Christof will die, and Christof's memory and traits will disappear. However, certainly on an idealist point of view, I think of more now like, there's this river, and you can observe these eddies in the river, right? These little whirlpools, and they may have existence for minutes or hours or a day or two, but ultimately, they get perturbed and they get reabsorbed by the water, and you're part of this. The identity is lost. You're now, being part of this vast ocean again. So that's how I think today about what's. So I'm sort of curious to see is this true? Is this what's going to happen at the point of my personal death? But of course, I won't be around really to witness it because I is going to die. But since it has died already a number of times in various experiences, that's okay too. I've gotten more and more cheerful ever since then.
Well, it's a beautiful image, this idea of eddies that momentarily form and then rejoin the larger flow of something greater. So I certainly enjoy that imagery. So Christof, this has been a fascinating conversation. Look, best of luck in your research, and you're both, professional and personal, and just trying to illuminate this mystery of the mind. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brian, for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.